Hello, World History 1 students. This is Mr. Everton, and this is a video all about ancient Egypt. We're going to be comparing Egypt to Mesopotamia, and at the end, you need to write 3 to 4 sentences explaining how Egypt was different from Mesopotamia. So, just like, we're going to start off talking about geography, and just like Mesopotamia, Egypt was one of the ancient river valley civilizations, which means it was built around a river. And here you can see a satellite image of that river, the Nile River in Africa. You can see that if it weren't for the Nile River, this part of Africa would be a desert. But because of the water that comes from the Nile River, you can see the bright green band running through the desert. That you can see the tan represents the desert. The deserts on either side, you have the Sahara Desert to the west and the Arabian Desert to the east, and those are features that are going to help to isolate Egypt to some extent, not completely, but help to isolate Egypt and also help to unify it and tie everything to the Nile River. And if you look, you can see there's this like thin band of the Nile River that runs through the desert until it gets up to the top, the northern part of the map, and it fans out into this green triangle. That's called the Nile Delta, and it's where the river meets the Mediterranean Sea, and it splits off into little tributaries. I guess it's not really tributaries, but little tiny branches of the Nile that then flow into the Mediterranean Sea and creates a larger, a larger section of fertile soil. One thing that's weird about ancient Egypt is that we call the Nile Delta the Lower Nile, even though it's to the northern part of the map. And we call the southern part of Egypt the Upper Nile, because that's what the Egyptians referred to it as. So the Lower Nile is the place where the Nile River meets the Mediterranean Sea in the north, where the delta is, and the Upper Nile is further south. And we also have some cataracts or waterfalls to the south, which sort of separate, to some extent, separate Egypt from the rest of Africa because they can't travel past those cataracts on the Nile River. An important thing to know about the Nile River, and a key difference between the Nile and the Tigris and Euphrates, is that it floods very reliably and very gently. The Tigris and the Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia flooded wildly and unpredictably, and they created lots of destruction. And people who lived in Mesopotamia were afraid of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and they thought of them as like gods that were angry and would destroy them. Here you can see a picture of the Nile flooding, and it's so gentle and so like not deep that you can see people walking across it. This happened at the same time every year, and Egyptian farmers were able to plan when they were going to grow their crops. And here we have Marvin the jealous Sumerian, whose name is cut off by my head. I'm sorry, Marvin. Marvin the jealous Sumerian wishes that the Tigris and Euphrates were just like, they're not though. They're not like the Nile. They're different. Another important aspect of the Nile River that helped ancient Egypt was that the current flows north towards the Mediterranean Sea, and the wind blows south away from the sea. And this facilitated transportation on the Nile River and also trade. So because the current flows one way, you can open up your sail and follow and let the wind blow you north. You can open up your sail and let the wind blow you south, and then when you want to go back up, you can put your sail down and you can allow the current to pull you back up to the north. And that again helped to unify Egypt, which is very different from the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, the rivers divided people up and broke them into little pieces and caused all kinds of fighting between different city-states. I'm sorry, Marvin the jealous Sumerian. It's the Nile's a better river. I don't know what to tell you. So let's talk about Egyptian society. Because Egypt was so unified by the Nile River, because the Nile created this one unified kingdom, it led to a lot of stability. It meant that Egyptian kings would basically rule unchallenged for their entire lives. These kings were called pharaohs. A pharaoh is just the name that they give to an Egyptian king. And pharaohs had complete control and complete power, and they were believed to be the sons of gods, because they were almost all guys. So they were a theocracy. They received, well, hold on, let me back up. They passed power down from one pharaoh to the next in a hereditary dynasty. Power was inherited. It was just like Mesopotamia in that way, that kings gave birth to sons who would then become king. And then it was also a theocracy. there, getting back to the theocracy thing, because the pharaoh was supposed to be the son of the god Horus, who you see pictured here. So pharaohs had religious authority. People listened to them because they believed that they had religious power. Some other social roles that were present in Egypt were farmers. Most people were farmers, like this guy and his wife. Here you can see them plowing a field. And here we have a pyramid representing Egyptian society. You can see the pharaoh is up on the top, and then we have a bunch of higher class positions, scribes, priests, etc. And then down on the bottom, most of Egypt's people were farmers. And then at the very bottom, there were slaves. Egypt, just like most places in the ancient world, did have slavery. So farmers did the hard manual labor of growing food, and slaves did the harder manual labor of growing food and building things and digging ditches and doing really unpleasant jobs without getting paid for it at all. And like Mesopotamia, there was a writing system in ancient Egypt, and the only people who knew how to write were the scribes. A scribe is a professional writer, somebody who knows the writing system and can work for the government in order to keep records. And the writing system in in Egypt was hieroglyphics or hieroglyphs. And here's a picture of some hieroglyphs. You can recognize hieroglyphs because they look like little birds and animals frequently. The reason why we are able to read hieroglyphics, the ancient Egyptian writing, is because of something called the Rosetta Stone, which is an artifact pictured here that was found, and it had Greek on one part of it and hieroglyphics on another. And because archaeologists understood how to read Greek, they could then use that Greek to translate the hieroglyphics. And then because of that, they were able to read all of these ancient Egyptian sources and better understand them. And that's why we know most of what we know about ancient Egyptian history. We're going to wrap up by talking about Egyptian religion, which, just like Mesopotamian religion, was polytheistic. They believed in many different gods and goddesses. Here is an illustration of some of them. A pantheon of Egyptian gods and goddesses just means a group. And here you have a tomb painting from ancient Egypt, which is painted inside a tomb. And you can see the god Osiris sitting down right there. And the god Osiris was the god of the dead. Much of Egyptian religion was centered on the afterlife. And there was a lot of focus on trying to live a good life so that you could have a good afterlife. And you can see the god Anubis is weighing somebody's heart on a scale to see if they've led a good and pure life. Because Egyptians were so focused on the afterlife, they mummified bodies. You probably heard about that before. They preserved the bodies of important people, particularly wealthy people, particularly pharaohs. Sorry, I'm doing this during the school day. You heard the bell. They would remove their internal organs because those things would rot. And then they would put them into clay pots like this with preservatives to keep them from falling, to keep them from deteriorating so that the dead person would be able to use them in the afterlife. And then they would wrap the body up in bandages, in linen bandages, and they would put the body into an expensive sarcophagus if the person was a pharaoh. And then they would bury that body, if of a pharaoh, they would bury the body in a pyramid. Pyramids, which you probably have heard about before, are massive buildings in ancient Egypt that were used as tombs for pharaohs. This is just basically a huge gravestone. And it's the most famous example of Egyptian architecture. So to summarize, we covered a lot of stuff in this video. We talked about the Nile. We talked about pharaohs and different social roles. That's a terrible typo. Sorry. We talked about hieroglyphics and how we're able to read them because of the Rosetta Stone. And we talked about Egyptian religion, which is polytheistic and believes in the importance of an afterlife. And thus, they mummified the bodies of important people and buried pharaohs in elaborate tombs called pyramids. Thanks very much for watching, and I will talk to you again next time.